I met Gracia, I think 2 years ago. We became dance partners. Yeah, so we started to practice more frequently and trying out new things. Like one day she came to the dance socials and then she was dressed in this like shirt and these pants and then got some interesting patterns and then it looked like not from this era. Then I was like, where do you get this from? Then it looked, very different. Then she's like, it's from my grandmother. Then I was like, oh, wow.
For me, when my grandmother passed away, that was something that I had this idea that would be nice to hold on to. My relationship with my grandmother was something that was difficult to express in words, quite literally, because she only spoke Hainanese, and I did not grow up learning Hainanese. After she passed, there was very little that she left behind for her grandchildren. The aunties were all like getting rid of all her stuff. All these pieces of clothing were still in very good condition. And so I was like, oh, can I like just take some of them? And they were like, okay, if you want to. So I kept about 10 pieces out of maybe like over 100 pieces that my grandmother sort of had.
The swing era actually stems from the 20s, the 30s and 40s. And it did start mainly in Harlem, in New York, in America. And the idea of the fashion of those days, it wasn't fast fashion, definitely. Clothes were made very carefully and the styling was more structured and of course not as casual as nowadays. Back in those times, you cannot go out unless you're wearing your hat and your coat and your proper shoes. And it went with the music of that era as well.
That is such an amazing era, but it's also very athletic. You are doing flips, you're doing like fast movements and stuff like that. So this is perfect because it kind of looks like, vintage-ish, but it allows for a lot of movement and I don't have to risk tearing any of the clothing that I have, which is a big concern because sometimes I do have my 1950s clothing and all that, but I'm always very concerned that it will rip or it will tear, and that's not something that I would dare to risk for any of my pieces.
I'm really impressed because Gracia has her own personality and she feels that the connection to the history and the culture through her grandmother's clothing, and she brings that to the dance floor. She makes it stylish. She makes it her own personality, and that's part of jazz. Jazz is about improvising, it's about taking a basic thing but making it your own and expressing yourself and being your own personality. So I really think it's so amazing that she's found a way to be unique on the dance floor, be herself, and yeah, I'm really, really happy to see that.
When I first wore these pieces out, and actually quite a few people kind of was commenting that, no, that's just way too old-fashioned, you're too young for this. I didn't mind it the way it looks like that right now, like this is how it's probably the most original form. But I did change it up sometimes to add a little bit more of a modern flair, I would say, to the way I wore. But still, people looked at it and I get a lot of comments, like almost every time. It's like, are you wearing your pajamas?
Yes, it looked a bit like pajamas, but then when you ask about it, then actually when you look closer, you realize actually the materials are actually quite nice. And I feel like one thing that always attracts people about vintage clothes is in the past, the techniques and the materials used were also very different. You can see that there's a quality to it, and then the design also, it looks like there's some effort that's put into it, even though you're wearing it at home.
So Gracia's piece, I think, is like an 80s velvet velour, and then she has it in a pantsuit. So they call it the samfu, which is not as well known as the qipao, but it's actually a very Nanyang, Southeast Asian Chinese style of clothing as well.
This wooden chest is actually from my grandmother, and she brought it from Hainan when she moved to Singapore, probably in the 1930s to 1940s. And I didn't realize it at that time about how valuable this chest is until I think one of my uncles came over to my house and was like, hey, you still have this from like Popo? And he said, you know, if you sell this is quite a lot of money right now, right? And I was like, yeah, but I'm not gonna sell it. So you can see I actually collect a lot of hats and vintage hats as well as vintage clothing. I typically don't put the clothing in here because they do need to breathe, but for hats they're okay. So these are some of the vintage hats that I actually collect, and they're all from all the different eras. Some of them I just pick up from flea markets all over the world. For clothing, I like to collect from anywhere from the 1920s to 1950s, but for the 1920s pieces, because they are very, very fragile, I actually have to keep them in like either a Ziploc bag like this, so that it doesn't risk getting getting torn.
A lot of the people in the Lindy Hop community are very interested in vintage. And all of them have different starting points, right? Some of them are from a sustainability kind of view. Some of them is like they are interested in the history, in the culture, in understanding, what fashion or life was like in a different time and a different place.
If you are respectful to the history, because Lindy Hop is African American culture, but it doesn't mean that you just slavishly copy. You have to understand what history means to the world, how it applies to society now, how the history of that time applies to us now. And we have to apply our own history so that we are not just appropriating, but we're understanding it and respecting it and having a dialogue with it to reflect, hey, we have our own history too and our own personalities.
See, I love that she's wearing her grandma's outfit and she's finding a way to bring it into new life, and she's not wearing it as a costume. So it's something that was made in the 80s, it was well loved, and she's found another way to play with it. I love that she's made it have like this modern, vintage retro look.
Wearing my grandmother's clothes is something that is very personal. Looking at the style, and of course, there are many people in Singapore who might have, this is something very familiar to them. Many grandmothers, or maybe I would say women of the older generation, they still have things like that. You can easily purchase this from anywhere in Chinatown. But really what is very dear is that this came from my grandmother. In a way, it's to also preserve some memories of her. So whether it's from my grandmother or for someone in the 1950s or 1920s, I imagine how that person would be wearing it and why they would be wearing it. And I just want to keep it as it is intended.
It comes with a certain level of craftsmanship, a certain level of aesthetic thought that was put into it. So vintage is special because it was made and tailored with a lot of love and knowledge and intention. So that's what it means to me, not just a clip.
There are a lot of things that I would love to say to my ama, I think, but most things I would have loved to say when she was alive. A lot of it's hard because, we couldn't speak the same language. But I think for Popo, I think more importantly is to know that I love her and the family loves her a lot. And whatever she has done for the family, we really appreciate it, and I really miss her as well. And Popo, we all remember you in our own ways. So for me, it's through these pieces of clothing. Yeah.